Welcome to Africa Untold, the place where we uncover the real history that textbooks tried to hide. Today, we explore one of the most powerful dreams in African history, a dream of unity, strength, and freedom, a dream called Pan-Africanism, the vision to unite Africa and its people against colonization. This is not just history. It's the story of a movement that still shapes our world today. So stay with us till the end, because this story belongs to all of us. To understand Pan-Africanism, we must first see what it rose against. In the late 19th century, European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85. With maps spread on tables, they carved up Africa like a cake. Nations that had existed for centuries were split into pieces. Tribes were divided by borders, and kingdoms were dismantled. Africa was now under chains of foreign rule. The colonizers spread propaganda. They claimed Africa had no history, no civilization, no future. The truth: Africa had kingdoms like Mali, Ethiopia, Nubia, and Congo, but Europe's lies tried to erase them. This brutal reality planted the seeds for Pan. Imagine the 18th and 19th centuries. Ships had long carried millions of Africans across the oceans, tearing them from their homelands. In the Caribbean, in the Americas, and in Europe, their descendants were born into slavery, racism, and humiliation. These men and women were told one thing again and again: forget Africa. Forget where you came from. That place is savage, dark, and worthless. But something unexpected happened. Instead of forgetting, a quiet fire began to burn in the small classrooms of the Caribbean, in churches of Harlem, in the writings of poets and scholars in London and Paris. Africans in the diaspora began asking dangerous questions. What if everything we were taught about Africa is a lie? What if being African is not shameful, but powerful? Think of Marcus Garvey standing before thousands, declaring, "A people without knowledge of their past is like a tree without roots." His words electrified hearts. Across oceans, Africans who had never set foot on the continent felt a deep calling. Africa is not just land. Africa is US. This was the first spark of Pan-Africanism, the awakening of a people scattered but not broken. The realization that they were not separate, but one family, bound by history, suffering, and hope. And from this awakening, a dream was born: unity, freedom, and the reclaiming of a stolen identity. London, the year 1900. The world still called Africa the Dark Continent. European empires had carved it up like a pie, and millions of Africans lived under the weight of colonial rule. And yet, in a modest hall in Westminster, something extraordinary was happening. A young Trinidadian lawyer, Henry Sylvester Williams, had gathered men and women from across the black world. Africans, Caribbeans, and African Americans sat side by side, people who had crossed oceans but shared one pain and one dream. The room was small, but the air was electric. For the first time, voices long silenced spoke boldly. They declared, "Colonialism is not civilization. It is oppression. Africa deserves dignity. Her people deserve rights." At that moment, they were not many. Outside, the world barely noticed. Newspapers dismissed them, politicians ignored them. But inside that hall, history was shifting, because what Williams and his companions planted that day was more than just protest. It was the seed of a movement, Pan-Africanism, a vision that one day, Africans everywhere would rise, not as scattered individuals, but as a united family demanding freedom. What began in that small gathering would echo across the 20th century, inspiring revolutions, independence movements, and the dream of a united Africa. The year 1900 had lit a spark in London. Henry Sylvester Williams and his companions had shown that Africans across the world could come together, even if only in a small hall. But every spark needs someone to fan it into a flame. That person was W.E.B. Du Bois. Born in America, Du Bois was no ordinary scholar. He studied at Harvard, even in Europe, mastering knowledge that few black men of his time were allowed to touch. But knowledge for him was not just for books, it was a weapon. He looked at the world around him and declared, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." In those words, he exposed the great injustice, that the line separating black from white shaped every nation, every opportunity, every future. Du Bois fought racism in America, but his vision was bigger. He saw that the fate of African Americans, of Caribbeans, of black people everywhere was tied to the fate of Africa itself. If Africa remained in chains, then none of its children anywhere in the world could truly be free. So he worked tirelessly writing, speaking, and most importantly, organizing. Through the Pan-African Congresses, he brought together leaders, activists, and thinkers. In these gatherings, strategies were discussed, alliances formed, and hope renewed. His books and essays shattered lies. He reminded the world that Africa was not a land of darkness, but the very cradle of civilization, that the pyramids, kingdoms, and scholars of Africa had once led the world and could rise again. Where Williams planted the seed, Du Bois watered it with knowledge and vision. Together, their efforts began to turn Pan-Africanism from an idea into a global movement. While Du Bois focused on intellectual debates, another figure electrified the masses. Marcus Garvey, a fiery Jamaican leader, preached the gospel of African pride. Through his movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, Garvey declared, "Africans at home and abroad." He urged Africans everywhere to embrace their roots, to build their own businesses, their own ships, and even to return to Africa one day. His movement became one of the largest mass organizations in black history, with millions of followers. Though colonial governments and Western powers tried to silence him, Garvey's message lived on. Africa must unite, and Africans must be proud. While voices in London and America spoke of unity and freedom, the reality on the African continent was far darker. Across Africa, colonial rule tightened its grip. In Kenya, vast stretches of fertile land were stolen, handed over to European settlers, while the native people were pushed into reserves, their ancestral homes taken from them. In the heart of the continent, the Congo Free State became a nightmare. King Leopold's agents forced villagers to gather rubber, and if they failed to meet impossible quotas, their punishment was brutal. Hands were severed, families destroyed, the land became a prison. Far to the south, in South Africa, racial segregation deepened. Black South Africans were treated as strangers in their own land, denied rights, stripped of dignity, laying the cruel foundations for what the world would later know as apartheid across the continent. The story was the same: forced labor, crushing taxes, traditions erased, languages silenced, and every act of defiance met with violence. And yet, in the villages, in the markets, in secret gatherings under the moonlight, whispers of resistance refused to die. Mothers told their children stories of freedom. Elders remembered ancient kings and queens. Young men and women began to dream of a day when the colonizers would be gone. The dream of Pan-Africanism, born in the diaspora and carried across oceans, now began to take root in Africa itself. Even in chains, hope lived on, a hope that one day, those chains would break. The two world wars shook the world, and Africa with it. Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers fought for European powers. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, they shed blood for nations that denied them freedom. When the wars ended, these veterans returned home asking, "If we are good enough to die for Europe's freedom, why are we not free in our own land?" This question gave rise to a new wave of African nationalism, fueled by Pan-African ideals. By the end of World War II, Africa was bleeding. Its people had been forced to fight in Europe's wars, to give their resources, their labor, and their lives, yet they still returned home to chains. But in October 1945, in the industrial city of Manchester, England, something powerful was unfolding. The Fifth Pan-African Congress was about to begin. Unlike the earlier meetings, this was no quiet gathering of scholars alone. This time, the voices of ordinary workers, trade unionists, women, and young activists filled the room, and among them were men who would soon change the course of history. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Hastings Banda of Malawi, and many others. The hall was alive with urgency. They were done with petitions, done with polite requests. Their message was thunderous. Colonialism must end, not tomorrow, not in theory, but now. In Manchester, the dream of Pan-Africanism leaped from speeches into action. Strategies for resistance were drawn, alliances were forged, and the seeds of independence movements were planted in soil that would soon crack open empires. From that Congress, leaders returned to Africa with fire in their hearts. Within years, the wave began: protests, strikes, rebellions, and ultimately, the crumbling of colonial rule. What began as whispers in the diaspora, as debates in London, as writings of Du Bois, now roared like a storm. The Manchester Congress of 1945 was not just a meeting, it was the birth cry of a new Africa. Out of the fire of Manchester, leaders returned to Africa with a mission. And in 1957, the impossible happened. Ghana broke free from British rule, becoming the first sub-Saharan African nation to win its independence. On that historic night, in Accra, crowds filled the streets, drumming, dancing, and weeping with joy, and at the center of it all stood their leader, Kwame Nkrumah. Before Nkrumah, Ghana's freedom was only the beginning. As he stood before his people, he declared, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." He carried a vision far larger than his own country, a dream of a United States of Africa, one currency, one army, one destiny. A continent that would no longer be divided by borders drawn in colonial offices, but united as one family. The dream was bold, and it was dangerous. Many African leaders hesitated, fearing the loss of their new national powers. The West, too, watched carefully, interfering, undermining, determined to keep Africa divided. But even as Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966, the fire he lit could not be extinguished. His dream of Pan-African unity became a torch passed from one generation to the next, a light that still burns across the continent today. Pan-Africanism was not just carried by men. Women like Amy, Ashwood Garvey, Fun Maleo, Ransom Kuti, and later Winnie Mandela played crucial roles. They organized protests, educated communities, and provided leadership in times of struggle. Their work proved that the fight for African freedom was not only political, but also social, cultural, and deeply personal. By the early 1960s, the tide of independence was sweeping across Africa. One by one, nations broke their colonial chains. But the question remained, could they stand together, or would they remain divided? In 1963, that question brought Africa's leaders to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the ancient land of emperors and unbroken independence. In the grand halls of the city, more than 30 newly free nations gathered. The air was thick with hope, but also with tension. At the center was Kwame, still calling for a United States of Africa. Others, more cautious, argued for gradual steps, fearing that unity might cost them their own fragile independence. And yet, despite their differences, they agreed on one historic act, the creation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, for the first time. Africa had its own platform, a place where its nations could speak with one voice against colonialism, against apartheid, and for the dignity of their people. The OAU was not perfect. Political rivalries and outside interference often weakened its power. Still, it laid a foundation. It was a declaration to the world that Africa would not remain silent, that its destiny would be shaped by Africans themselves, and, though decades later the OAU would transform into the African Union, the spirit born in Addis Ababa still lives on, the dream of Pan-African unity, carved into history. The dream of Pan-Africanism was never limited to the continent. In America, the civil rights movement drew inspiration from African independence struggles. Leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of global solidarity with Africa. In the Caribbean and Latin America, Pan-African ideas fueled cultural pride and resistance against colonial legacies. The diaspora and the continent were bound together in the same fight. Music, literature, and art became weapons of Pan-African identity. Reggae in Jamaica carried messages of unity and freedom. Afrobeat, led by Fela Kuti in Nigeria, became a soundtrack for political resistance. Writers like Chinua Achebe and Ngujwa Thuajo used literature to reclaim African stories from colonial narratives. Culture became the heartbeat of Pan-Africanism. Despite the dream, Pan-Africanism faced many challenges. Colonial powers deliberately left Africa divided with artificial borders. Ethnic rivalries were fueled, and leaders who pushed too hard for unity, like Nkrumah, were overthrown with outside support. Even today, economic dependence on the West, corruption, and internal conflicts make African unity difficult. But the idea of Pan-Africanism refuses to die today. Pan-Africanism lives on in new forms. The African Union, continental free trade agreements, and youth-led movements are all modern expressions of the dream. Across the diaspora, Pan-African culture thrives in music, film, and activism. The struggle continues, but so does the vision. Africa rising, not divided, but united. This was the story of Pan-Africanism, a dream born in chains, carried by visionaries, and kept alive by generations of Africans and the diaspora. It was a call for unity, freedom, and pride. And though challenges remain, the dream still burns in the hearts of millions. Thank you for watching Africa Untold. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because together, we keep Africa's true history alive.